everybody. This is Maciej Kuchara. I'm going to be your instructor in this futuristic character design course. Over next 8 classes, or 8 weeks if you sign up for a mentorship, we'll be talking about creating futuristic characters and designing them. I'll be going over a couple of tricks and techniques to create those characters. I'll be trying to explain which techniques work best for specific scenarios. We'll also talk a little bit about approaching clients, working with clients, and working with feedback, as well as how to deal with obstacles that you might have when you're working on a project. So let's get started. I want to start with the creative brief. And creative brief in essence is just the idea that is behind what you're supposed to do. If you're working with client, for instance, then creative brief will be an email or a phone call. If you're working with your friends, that could be a discussion that you have within yourselves, between yourselves. If you're working for yourself and you're just creating your own images for fun, just to create something that you have in your head, then creative brief will be the idea that you have in your head. The creative brief for this class is very simple. I wanted to focus on character design, futuristic character design, and that's going to be a subject of this course. There's few bullet points that I've mentioned here, and I will just quickly go over them and explain how we will approach the design of this character. So, just to make things easy and simple for you to digest and show how different techniques apply over next 8 lessons, I decided that we'll create a female character. She's going to be a mercenary. It's going to be a futuristic character, which means futuristic means anytime in the future. We are not specifying exactly when, whether it's a far distance future or a near future. That doesn't really matter here. One thing that really matters is that this character is supposed to be lightweight, which means any gear that this character will be wearing is not going to look heavy. This character is supposed to be strong, which means this character will have whether muscularity or the expression of a really strong person. Damaged armor, by this I mean wear and tear, pretty much. So there will be damages appearing on the armor and whatnot. And then spaceship graveyard is basically a description of what you might see in the background. So that's pretty much in a nutshell the creative brief for this class. So let's get started. Before we jump into creating anything, I wanted to quickly go through the tools that you'll see me using throughout this class, this first lesson. And we'll start with user profile. Obviously, we'll be using Photoshop, which you can see on the screen. And now you probably noticed that my UI looks totally different, or maybe looks pretty similar to your UI, but looks slightly different than your default UI. And I'll show you. Default UI usually would look like this, which you have color swatches, colors, libraries, adjustment styles, and all those items. I barely use those ever. The idea is that I want my screen to be as less populated as possible. So whenever I'm creating, I don't have to go into full screen mode too often. I still have everything at my disposal, all my tools at my disposal. So that way I do less clicks when I work, and I can just work with my flow. 3 things I always keep, which I use a lot, is obviously layers, history, and channels. Those are only 3 tabs that I'm using here, and you can obviously move them away or dock dock in the different positions. I like to have it look like this. Basically, you can also add things like, let's say you really use a lot of swatches, so maybe you want to have swatches here. You can dock the swatches here. That's fine, and you can also create your own list of swatches. But I never use that or barely use that, so I have it hidden. Anything that is not being used too often, I have it hidden, so I have as much screen space as possible. So if this is probably the mode I will be working the most, where I still see UI. This is only if I want to zoom really close. So if I'm painting something and I'm going to zoom really close, I almost do like pixel editing, which I barely do. But the idea is that right now I'm not seeing my UI, so I might be searching for tools. So this is in a nutshell what I would do with the UI. I like to start with the grayscale images too. When I'm painting, I'm trying to avoid working in a low res. So for instance, thumbnail sketches, I'll try to go above 1200 pixels for each thumbnail. But because I usually want to populate the canvas with different thumbnails, I would start with like 4500 pixels wide. Now, depending on your computer speed, you might want to choose a smaller canvas or work on each thumbnail separately. That's absolutely fine. I just prefer to have a larger canvas because later on, if you need to scale up, you're not losing that many details anymore. Now, the way I set up everything is I work with shortcuts. I use keyboard. You probably, it depends on what kind of person you are. Some people use keyboard shortcuts. Some people use buttons on the screen. If you're using Cintiq, you will have a lot of buttons. If you're using Intuos, you'll have buttons on the Intuos as well. Matter of my own preferences, I'm using keyboard because keyboard has a lot of options, and I've memorized a lot of tools that I use, and I like to have them available to me without searching which button I have to press. Probably if I would press buttons a lot, I would memorize them too, but there's way less buttons and way less options to choose from than the keyboard itself, so I use that. And then lastly, what shortcuts I use. Now, there's a few things that I've changed up when I'm working, and I'll explain in a second. So you can change shortcuts by going to edit shortcuts, obviously, and I suggest to go to the tools and look through the list of shortcuts you have here. One thing I've changed is I made sure that I have smudge tool on a shortcut. In this instance is R, and I don't think I've changed anything else here. Well, marquee tools and lasso tools are here anyways. And then I do have application menu shortcuts as well. You'll notice that I'm flipping image a lot back and forth, which you can find in image. And then it will be somewhere here. Flip canvas horizontally and vertically. So you see Control Alt Q, I'll be able to flip canvas. So if I'm painting, you can see that I'm doing this a lot. And you'll notice me doing this a lot. Why do I have smudge tool? Because I like to, when you're painting, for instance, and I'm making brush strokes right now, different colors, and you see there's a sharp edge to it. Instead of just constantly choosing different brushes and softness and trying to sort of get the blending, with smudge tool, you can blend those things nicely, right? And you will see, okay, but I'm blending right now. I'm trying to blend with my smudge tool, but it looks different. Here is why. Let's go to brushes, and let me explain why I'm using smudge tool and why it looks like this. Because normally when you press smudge tool, it's not gonna give you the same effects. The effects you're gonna be getting will be more or less like this instead. But you see, it's just basically almost like pressing a finger and smudging it away. It doesn't create this scattering effect. So if I'm doing this, it just creates a lot of lines, which doesn't look that great. The reason for this is very simple. If you go to brush settings, you look at spacing and you look at scattering. The more spacing you do, the more different this is gonna look. I'll actually make it bigger. It doesn't actually make that much difference in spacing. So eventually it does, but it's not affecting canvas the way I would like to. Now, if you go to scattering, and let's make the spacing smaller and then make it scatter. Now you will see it's creating this weird effect. Basically, what it means is when you press a button, and I'll make it show like this. When you scatter, each press of a button is creating more than one dot, right? So your brush is a circle. Like if you have a circular round brush, if you press and drag, you'll see that the dots that you're painting are scattered around. And this is how basically it works. So when you want to smudge, right, it's the same principle. It will scatter the dot that you're trying to smudge in different areas. And all of a sudden, you have this nice blend showing up here. And the best brush I use for this is this one. It's gonna be available with this class. You will have all those brushes you see here are available in the class, so you'll be able to use them as well. It's creating a nice effect, nice blending effect between those values, right? So I can change the opacity or the strength of scatter and create really smooth looking surfaces. And I use that a lot. And that's pretty much it. So that explains pretty much what tools I'll be using in this class. One thing that I might add actually at the very end is types of brushes, because I get this question a lot. I'm sure professional artists are getting this question a lot. Like, what brush do you use to paint your pictures? Well, here's the thing. I try to use, you see I have a lot of brushes, right? But I don't use them all. I sometimes use like this brush, maybe once in a while. I only keep it because on that very instance, this brush will be very helpful. On that one very instance, it will just save me a lot of time. The more brushes you have, the harder it is to navigate. But the idea is that as soon as you start using those brushes, you'll learn to navigate, and you remember the positions of your brushes. There's two types of brushes I use. There is a round or square brush that has sharp edge, that has no scattering or no texture information. So when I'm painting, even if it's having like opacity change, it's creating like a gradient as I'm painting. There's no texture information, right? And the second type of the brush I'm using is texture brush. Now, texture brushes will have more information in the brush stroke. So for instance, this brush has sharp edges, but it has a texture information in it. And it's great for making like a painterly look or creating a texture on top of your sketch. Like you imagine you want to have different material, like this could be a leather material, and it's going to be way easier to do that this way than choosing, round brush and trying to do dots by dots by dots. It's just taking too much time. Now, let's say you're sketching a thumbnail and you want to make it look like it's it's painted on canvas and it feels like a sketch, right? You can use one of those brushes that has not so sharp edges, and you just paint like this, and all of a sudden it looks more like a sketch rather than if you would use, for instance, this brush. It still looks like sketch, but it's very nice. It doesn't have like almost a canvas information to it. It feels like being painted on a very smooth surface. One thing it's great for is, let's say you're painting like this and you're erasing like this, you're creating very sharp edges, which is great, which is fantastic. When you're using texture brush, you're not getting that sharp edge effect anymore. So you have to be really careful how you use this. Generally, I like to sketch with brushes that have some kind of texture information, so they feel more natural, they feel more traditional almost. It's just that nostalgia to traditional drawing. But if I only want to work on shapes, then I'll use hard-edged brushes. Lastly, I wanted to start talking about references, and for references I use this smart application called PureRef. PureRef is a really small application. It's really easy to install. It doesn't take too much space, and it's really great. I've been using it ever since I've discovered it. The way I collect references and the way I use the references on this application is I just drag and drop whatever I feel that will be really important and really connected to the subject and to the creative brief. Now, we've discussed about using Creative Brief to basically consolidate all the ideas of what you will be creating. It's basically your roadmap to how you're going to paint and what you're going to paint and what tools you will be using. So we wanted to create a futuristic character design. It was supposed to be female, mercenary. So obviously someone who know how to use weapons and is very cunning and know how to defend and is basically a contractor. Lightweight means armor that is not too heavy or weapons that are not too heavy. Damaged, wear and tear, and strong. So let's quickly go through the points and how I picked references to each of those. Let's start with female, mercenary, and strong. So this reference is perfect because it's a fitness model. You can see strength that comes from her muscles, the way it's sculpted together. It's gonna work really well as a character. So I've chose this reference just for that. It's a female. It's a very beautiful looking female with a lot of good sculpted shapes that we will want to use in our class, in our design. Now I've also chosen engine parts and helmets and military equipment, basically because it gives me a good grounding point to what I want to convey. So you as a person who's going to watch the design process will understand the final result. There's two ways you can design basically. One is grounded and one is very abstract. Now, the more abstract you go and the more you create, you design with the ideas and shapes that are basically conveying your speak of mind, the less connected it's going to be to the audience. The more elements like engine parts or armor parts or weapons that already exist use, people understand what they're seeing because they understand it from real life. But it's going to be maybe not so sophisticated and not so great looking anymore, right? So it's finding the balance between two of those. And in this course, I want to teach you how to find that balance and what obstacles you'll be facing when finding that balances. So I have engine parts, and I'm just going to quickly go through what I mean by those. So for instance, I've chose this reference not only because it's just an engine and it has a lot of cool looking detail that could be possibly turned into something that looks futuristic, but also because it has a lot of flat surfaces. Apart from reflections, those surfaces are pretty they don't have too much detail. Right, and also you have surfaces and elements that are really detailed, like those wires here and pipes and different shiny materials, and there's a big material difference. Like this is very shiny and reflective, those are more worn out and dirty. So I want to make those differences in materials first, but also have the idea of having a lot of details in the confined spaces covered by surfaces that are not too detailed. So it's great, nice balance of detail. You don't want to overwhelm yourself with details because your image is going to become too noisy. Same story with this image. It's pretty much the same principle. Now this image is really interesting because what it shows is nice integration between different elements. I like how those elements sit together. You have a chassis that's covering some of the more detailed, noisy parts of the engine, but you also have the pipe that is really nicely sculpted around. So I really like how it's connecting, and I want to use that in my designs. Similar idea to this helmet. It shows you like different layering, which is great. That's something you might use in your design as well. Layering adds depth to your creation and basically allows you to create something that is more interesting and has more meaning than just armor piece, for instance. And then this image shows nice, interesting wear and tear where there's like duct tape attached to it. Maybe there's a damage that would be too expensive to change the part, so let's just use duct tape on everything, right? And then we have those worn edges and all that cool stuff, like dirt on the surfaces so they don't look clean and pristine. And lastly, this image, what I like about it is the straps, and I want to use straps elements because you can connect things with straps or make them tighter. You can also attach a lot of things to those straps if you have clamps, and it's easy to move around. It's very flexible, and it's also, you know, different material, which is really interesting. It adds additional layer to your overall design. So that's briefly what references I will use. I'll be looking at those, and also I'll be looking at more references as well. But if you create a brief and if you create a set of references like this, you'll have a good idea what you're supposed to do, and then you can start sketching. So let's start sketching.